Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, October 21st, and we're here at Sunraven to talk to you this week about another subject, the subject in follow-up to a moon letter that I sent out last week. Moon letters, for me, are defined by a newsletter that I write and compose with a thought that is sent out on the morning of the new moon every month. And so last month's moon letter was on the subject of the cycle of death and dying, and I used the metaphor of seeing the forest for the trees, essentially discussing the subject about seeing how there is always potential for growth even after a devastating fire. And the idea behind some of the idea behind the message was to get people to think about the possibility of rebirth and growth even when you're feeling like things are not going well, or even when you're in the midst of a destructive state. Right now, of course, in our world, we are all feeling something to the effect that we're witness to destruction around us in terms of the environment, the way how people are treating other people, and how the environment is maybe producing or unleashing other conditions, diseases in particular, like infectious diseases like COVID, that while there might be a scientific explanation for how they're arising, are plaguing us, literally speaking, and forcing our lives into a different rhythm. And for many people, that's very uncomfortable if it's not just immediately threatening to their own existence. And so it just keeps coming. All this stuff keeps coming, and there's a lot of despair associated with it. And the message of Sunraven, of slow medicine, is about seeking light even in the midst of a dark place. So the story of Sunraven, just for those who may not know, this is the home we live in, but it didn't always have that name. It was originally called 501 Guard Hill Road, which is the street address. And when we acquired the property, there was a story that there was a raven that was living in the house, that the people who previously owned the house were wildlife photographers. They also happened to rescue orphaned or abandoned animals, one of which was a raven. And I knew the story of the raven when we bought the house, and it seemed to me that the raven's energy remained part of the home's identity. And rather than use an address for this healing center and space that we were looking to create, I thought it seemed to be right there for us to use the energy of the raven in the name as a representation of the place. I put another word in front of raven, randomly, frankly, but perhaps not so randomly. I just thought of the word sun and raven. I saw the raven as a dark image. I happen to be very drawn to the sun and light, and so I thought about it, and one day in a creative moment said Sunraven is going to be what we're going to call this place. After I did that, I went to Google, which is what most people do, and looked up Sunraven just to see if that was a name that was used anywhere else. And it impressed me. Didn't really surprise me, but impressed me that in fact the Sunraven was a very well established Native American totem, meaning a story, a metaphor, a representation of a particular understanding of life and life cycles. And the story was, to cut it short, though I would suggest you go onto our website, slowmedicine.org, and you can see the story, the full story of the Sunraven. But essentially, it's the story of the restoration of light. And so the Pacific Northwestern Native Americans saw the raven and this particular creative aspect of raven as an important component to humanity. When there seems to be darkness, the raven has a way to help restore light, specifically the Sunraven. And so it's apt that we're going to discuss this today, and it is a theme of many of the discussions we have and the work that we do, which is to help people recognize the nature of darkness and the nature of light, and find a way to use light to enlighten the darkness. We can even see that as a metaphor for what people often do in their work of life, which is to become enlightened. You know, this word keeps repeating itself. And so in last month's Moon Letter, when I discussed about the cycles of life and death, I was immediately thinking that the next follow-up, which is what this program is today, should be on, well, practical measures, which is when you're facing darkness, how do you, it's a nice concept, bring light to it, but how do you actually do that? Because for many people in many situations, that's actually quite challenging. And you don't feel good in general when you're in darkness, and you don't have a lot of energy. And so it's beyond some people's grasp, and we want to help you do that. So the last thing I'll say before I want to turn it over to Robin, which is in the title of this week's talk, which is Reflections on the Shadow. So it's, the title is, Overcoming Darkness, Reflections on the Shadow. And to me, I want to just point out one more thing. So shadows, the darkness, can only be produced if something obstructs the light. So if you think about the word shadow and what it represents in your life, that you only can see a shadow only appears if something is obstructing light. And the metaphor for today then is not to look at shadows as a problem, as bad. They are a representation that something is in the way of light. And if we can work with the shadow, can identify what that something is, we have a real opportunity to get back into the light. And so that's what I want Robin to now talk about, which is in her work in the psychological realm. People often think of the darkness and their shadows as something negative, as something, to dismiss or to get rid of. But we're seeing it, as an opportunity. There is an obstacle of some sort, not a problem. The problem is that we can't address the obstacle. But if the obstacle is potentially the path, which is the solution. And so, Robin, the question I have for you is, how do you define shadow first? And then, related to it is, how do you work with that?
Right. Well, I think you had a good explanation. First off, it's one of my favorite topics and one of the most essential to begin the healing process, to actually embrace the shadow and the shadow work. So how we may see it in ourselves, we can define it as these parts of ourselves that we deny, and as Michael was saying, obstruct, the light coming in, the shadow that can be terrifying to the psyche, the soul, and how important it is for us to gently, and I'll get into some practice after, what we can do to just first be aware and let us share with you to move into wholeness. Shadow work is essential, and that is also well-respected wisdom of Carl Jung, and felt that pressing down or denying these more difficult parts of our personalities, it's a part of our personality. Part of his message is we actually can't come into wholeness if we reject the shadow. So
which I think, as I'm thinking about it, and as I was saying, is a natural inclination may be for us when we are feeling darkness around us is to try to get away from it, try to move out of it, and then ultimately to repress it, deny it, reject it. People try that. I think that it could be said, I'm speaking from personal experience, that my first inclination is to just, get rid of it. We know, I think, especially if things that keep recurring, it's not going away because we wish it away. Instead, Jung would say, and others, no, this keeps coming back for a reason, that it's your path. It's something you need to more fully examine. And Robin used the word embrace. In fact, embrace because it is going to help you when you really fully understand it. Maybe immerse yourself in it, process it, digest it, assimilate it, whatever the requirement is. When you do that, eventually then it becomes part of you. It's no longer an obstacle to block the light, and that's when you talk about wholeness, how wholeness gets restored. So it's essential to work with the shadow. And then the follow-up question I have for you is, so how do people identify what their shadow is? Because I think you may know, okay, I got some shadows. You may make that assumption. It's a good assumption, by the way. I've got some shadows, but how do I know what they are? How do I develop a better understanding, not just naming them, but what they mean, and how do I work with them?
Okay, well, yes, I think you also said earlier is to first be curious and willing to ask yourself this question. Am I willing to look at these parts of myself? That's part of it. The other part is you may notice where it shows up in your life, and so some people start there, where they may come into me to do some of their own personal work, where things in life are have ruptures, where relationships are not communicating properly, or some of it can be in our just patterns, our lifestyle patterns, which I'm gonna, because I don't want to make it a negative, our addictions, thoughts that are repetitive. And I want to be careful to not talk about the emotions versus, I want to separate thoughts versus emotions, because part of the healing process, to begin diving in there a little bit, is to ask yourself, what am I feeling? And the reason why it's so important that we can discern, if we are evaluating ourselves, we tend to repress that part, which might be the shadow. Emotion, it could have come from childhood, where we weren't allowed to express, our sadness or our anger, that we were told that it was unacceptable. So shame and feelings of parts of ourselves that we might look at where we feel they're not accepted in the outer world is a really good place to start.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. We probably, with a little bit of help from another person, or like somebody like Robin, who's trained to do this, could bring out in us, by asking us good questions, to see more clearly what those shadow elements may be. But I think most of us have a sense, like if you look at your own recurring behaviors, things that you get caught up in, problems that keep recurring, there's probably a shadow element in any of those situations. But then we identify the shadow. Let's say we identify the shadow. Let's say I'm, addicted to, let's say, and addictions that's a loaded word, but I'm addicted to something sensual, whether a material thing, food, sex, money and what it buys, all those things, substances. I see that that's happening, that I can't get my mind off of it. My behaviors keep having me go back into it, and there's some sort of trouble I get myself into, or there are feelings that I have about myself, which is, like you said, shame or judgment, criticism. These just keep coming up. So we all have some things like that. Those are our shadows. That's sort of, there's a shadow there. Now, how do you work with that, though? So you identify it. So, you identify the pattern. Let's take something, could be innocuous, chocolate. I'm addicted to chocolate. I can't get my mind off of chocolate. There's not too much judgment around that, so I want to go say it there. But that's a metaphor for other things that could be definitely more loaded. I see that. Okay, so now how do I work with that? What is the first step?
That's a good example. So the first step is to ask yourself. I'm gonna answer that. First step is to ask yourself, what am I feeling? When we have repetitive patterns of eating chocolate or shopping, it's just now the question, am I curious about my actions? So many of us will eat the chocolate and get all excited. So one of my favorites is to start with, how will I feel before, during, and after? Because most of the time we feel great before we do something. While we're doing it, it feels really great. And I think it's the aftermath, which is really where we can get the juice of how we feel. And does this enhance our life, or does it, take away? So the first question is, what am I feeling? Second step is to go through that whole process before, during, and after. And what's really most important before that, I think, is that you believe that you are worthy of healing. That you are worthy. When I say healing, I'm talking about wholeness. And this is really, really important about the light and the shadow. To be whole, we need to understand that we are part of the shadow is
right.
a part of our soul.
I think that
as much as the light.
I think that gets to the point of accepting yourself, even if you're imperfect, as worthy, because only when you have that in place do you have the courage, perhaps, to look at the dark side, the stuff that keeps emanating. And it doesn't mean if you have a dark side, it proves you're not worthy. Quite the opposite. When you assume you have faith that you are worthy, it allows you then to look more carefully at even a darkness and then get curious. You then, because you can say, how do I feel after, not before, during. Before, during is usually positive, but after
right.
It's coming back to me, it's not good.
Right.
There's something there that needs to be resolved. And you go to those feelings that you're saying, which is, I feel lonely, I feel isolated, I feel angry, I feel frustrated, I feel unworthy. You realize that there's some message embedded in you that is producing an energy that becomes the obstacle for letting the light completely flow. And so
I just want to add to how important it is not to skip over the emotions. They are essential. There are people out there that go to the gym, they meditate, they do all kinds of practices to move away, because we think we want to move into the light. So to get to the light, we need to embrace what the negative feelings, the negative emotions, and allow them to process and give us information. So that's really, really important.
Right.
Because
so we're gonna work with the emotions as opposed to rejecting them as well, because the emotions that we have, the hard emotions, often are related in some way to shadow elements. And look, this obviously is a very big subject. It's also very personal, although we also could have collective shadows we could talk about another time. But the dominant message, I think, is that we all have shadows. The shadows get in the way of light fully filling us in terms of the state of wholeness. And because it's such an important subject, it's deserving of your attention and some work. And that's perhaps what we'll leave you with, which
and
is...
And I know we're wrapping up, but I just have to throw in there quickly to give some practice. Simple tools, real quick. I know we're ending our show. Number one is to embrace the emotions. Number two is to remember to always hold yourself in love, which is unconditional. There's no evaluation, to stay in acceptance, move from denial into acceptance of what is. And then some practical things that you can do. You can write a letter. You can just write to yourself these parts. Just put it on paper. You can do the journaling that we've talked about before. You could sit in meditation as long as you're embracing everything that is there and not rejecting. So we want to not skip over the shadow, and we don't want to just get to the light. If we go through the darkness, we get to the light. So I wanted to just share that.
That I think is a great point.
An ending point today to give you some hope.
Go through it. Go through it. See it as a real opportunity, in a way, on your path, is to step on that stone. And even if it disturbs you a little bit, that it exists, that it's there, it seems to be an obstacle. It's not an obstacle of your path. It is the path. So,
and ask questions. Ask for guidance from the universe, from spirit, just start with the questions and then just turn that over and give yourself some time, and those things will be revealed to you spiritually.
And at the very last, you probably could benefit from some help. And that's part of what we do here. And we would love to hear from you. And we would love to be part of your life in a meaningful way. When we help somebody, we help ourselves, because part of our own path is to share this. And of course, you can share it with other people too. In all likelihood, all of us have been mentors or advisors to somebody else in our lives, and we probably have given some decent advice. So, but it's sometimes hard to take your own. And this is where some sort of working partnership, professional relationships can be really supportive. So that's essentially what we do here at Sunraven, which is the home of slow medicine. Slowmedicine.org is the website, and it's the philosophy about our approach to establish wholeness by seeing the interconnectedness of different parts of our being and our communities, and to try very much to work through these challenging times together. So please send us a note, say hello, if nothing else, but also give us some recommendations on ideas for topics you would like us to cover. Email us, info@slowmedicine.org is the email, and we'll see you next week with another hopefully interesting conversation, or at least subject to build upon.
Yes. So, and trust that your soul has all the answers right within. So I'll leave you with that. Have a beautiful week until next week.
All right.
Namaste.
Peace to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.